Quentin, if I want to prove theism, what I have to do is to expose theism to its most rigorous fallacy analysis to see where are fallacies in something I want to exist. I have to do that. I just can't try to prove theism exists. I have to go at it the other way. So I turn to you and ask you, what are the fallacies in the way of thinking, the logic embedded in theism?
Well, there's several fallacies, starting with the fact that they use some part of science as evidence for God, and yet God, as an explanation, is inconsistent with science because it posits an entity, a disembodied mind, that is inconsistent with the fields of science, such as neurophysiology and psychology, that show there's no such thing as a mind without a brain or body, and also it shows that there is no state of the universe that is not caused by an earlier state, and so God has nothing to cause. And so they pick out just certain parts of science and then ignore all the rest of it, ignore the scientific method.
So it's like cherry-picking science, which creates a logical inconsistency in their whole argument.
Right, because they both accept science and reject it. They accept the part that claims evidence for God, then reject it by claiming that the explanation is theistic.
Okay, so that's one.
Okay.
What are some other fallacies?
One would be that the arguments for God's existence actually are arguments for God's non-existence, if you examine them closely. Because the arguments, one is the cosmological argument, one is the argument for design. There are arguments for a cause of the universe.
Which is the cosmological argument. There has to be, every series of causes has to have a first cause.
Right, and also a designer in the design argument.
Right.
But a cause cannot be something that's omnipotent, because something that's omnipotent, it logically entails the universe exists. So you have an act of will by God, a divine willing or creation by an omnipotent being, and it's logically impossible. The universe could not follow from that.
Let's help me through that one. You have an omnipotent God can do anything.
Right.
So can't that God create a universe? Actualize, as they say, from all the possibilities that he thinks about, pick one and actualize it? Why not?
Well, the word wouldn't be create or cause, because cause, as it's used in the cosmological and other arguments, is the cause we mean in discussing causes in nature and in everyday life, where the cause does not logically imply the effect. So you can't hear a noise on the roof and then deduce, that's a bird falling on it. And so what in the case of God, if a being that can do anything, is all powerful, when he tries to do something of logical necessity, it has to follow.
Right.
And so that is a stronger type of necessity than causal necessity, or something need not follow, because causes in the world are not omnipotent. And so if
you sound like a theist. That's right.
Okay. Well, if the cosmological argument and the design argument are sound, and there is a cause of the universe, it can't be God, because God is not a cause.
So what
God logically entails the universe. He doesn't cause it.
So what you're saying is that the concept of God being omnipotent and then logically entailing the universe is a contradiction with there being a first cause of the universe. Those two things don't fit together.
Right. And that hasn't been recognized. I think the reason why is that the correct conception of causality that people share today wasn't fully recognized until Hume. And Hume pointed out, well, a cause does not logically imply its effect.
Okay, but in that argument, what you've done is you've disenfranchised, if you will, the cosmological argument, but you've done it by using God as an omnipotent being. So, maybe a theist will say, okay, you've hurt my cosmological argument, but you've reinforced my omnipotent being that entailed the universe.
No, I'm just saying that if you take the cosmological argument for a first cause, then among the possible explanations, someone might suggest the possibility, the conceptual possibility, that an omnipotent being caused it. And I'm saying that cannot be an answer, because the argument is for a cause, not for something that logically implies the universe. Something that logically implies it would be a proposition. In the same way that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or in the same way that an elm tree is a tree. I mean, they logically imply their conclusion. They aren't causes. But this is what an omnipotent being is. Because an omnipotent being, by logical necessity, whatever it wills has to come about. And so it's not a cause. And causes are understood as things that usually do bring things out, but don't logically have to. The effect may not come about.
What are some other arguments that theists use that are fallacious?
I think the idea, which is they take for granted, is that the God is even conceivable. Because the God they are talking about has no sense organs, has no body, has no brain, and yet is conscious of everything, is creating everything,
sustaining everything,
and when you try and think of it, you can't really think of it. And what's going on in a person's mind when you're thinking of it is that they're thinking of something else. They're kind of mixing in images of something that sort of has a body and sort of doesn't, a fuzzy image. But strictly speaking, that the concept is inconceivable. And I think another argument that should be mentioned is that there's an illusion that all these people believe in God. Because once you ask them what God means, people say something very different. You ask one person, they say they think God is moral goodness. You ask another, they say, well, I think that God is love. Another say God is nature. And analytic philosophers, about 2,000, 3,000 of them, they've decided on agreed definition of God. But the general public doesn't agree with them, the rest of the world doesn't. And so the fact that virtually everybody who says they believe in God, they're using a word that means something different for each person.
Well, some theists would say that they're all right, that God is the embodiment of all of these properties and characteristics. And the fact that God has no body, well, what do you expect? How do you expect the creator, cosmic consciousness, the force behind the universe to have a body? That's anthropomorphizing. That'd be silly. That the kind of God that it can be God, the only kind of being that can be God, has to have an incorporeal, no body and no sense organs, and has to have all of these properties that different people say, that is an affirmation of the real God, irrespective of what popular opinion may be.
Well, there's no basis for that particular view, because we can imagine larger and larger beings with bodies who could create large segments of our universe, and we could keep getting larger and larger, and each larger segment could be caused by some other very large creative being. But when they say that you need a disembodied mind to cause the universe, the problem is that the concept of a disembodied mind is inconceivable. It's words. You can't really conceive anything when you're saying them.
Everybody would agree with that, but they would say that we need a something that doesn't have a cause. We need an end to explanation. We cannot have an infinite series that go on and on with explanation. We need an end, and we have to define an end. And that end we define as God. The end of all explanation.
Well, if everything is already explained by a state of the universe being caused by an earlier state, then there's nothing left to be explained. And so explanation is over by the time you finished with a scientific explanation of all the states. You say, well, end of explanation. Well, what do you want to explain?
What's left?
Yeah, there's nothing left to explain.
Well, I guess what we're saying is that's the crux of this matter. That's where it ends. Does the infinite series or very long series of causation end with a blurring into almost zero and in it being self-caused? Or do you have to say the whole process has to have an independent cause? That's the nexus. That's the end of the explanation, one of those two possibilities.
Well, the problem is by saying blurring. Actually, it doesn't blur, because it's very strictly shown by mathematical cosmology that if each state of the universe after the Big Bang 15 million years ago corresponds to some decimal on the real decimal line, but that there is no state of the universe that corresponds to zero, because it's an impossible state. But there is no state in the universe that comes right after zero in the real numbers, because before in the real numbers, there's an infinite number of decimals before every decimal. And so there is no first state. And so each state then has a cause in earlier states. And so there is nothing left to explain. And if you have to, what explains the whole? Well, you can answer, well, I've just explained that each part of the whole is caused by an earlier part. These parts exist, and that by itself logically implies the whole exists, because the parts of a whole can't exist unless the whole does. So the whole can't have an extra explanation. This is just a logical implication of there being parts to that whole. It would be like saying there exist a lot of parts, but there's no whole. And that's a contradiction. And so, in fact, it's just a logical truth that if the parts exist, the whole exists. If all the parts are explained, and it's a logical truth, they imply that the whole exists, then there can't be an explanation of the whole, because it's just a matter of logic, it exists.